Russia's oligarchs just made a discovery that changes everything. Not the public, not the protesters, not Western analysts. The oligarchs. The men who built billion-dollar empires under Putin's protection. The ones who have survived every crisis, every sanction, every power play for 3 decades are now staring at numbers that they were never supposed to see. Interest rates that are strangling entire industries. Hidden war debts buried so deep that even Kremlin insiders didn't know the full scale. Energy revenues collapsing under sanctions and forced discounts. Refineries burning after Ukrainian drone strikes. Rail freight at its lowest point in 16 years. For years, these men played the game. Stay loyal, stay quiet, let Putin handle the war, and the money will keep flowing. That deal is breaking apart. And here's why that matters more than any battlefield loss, any protest, any sanction package. Authoritarian regimes don't collapse when people get angry. They collapse when the insiders stop believing. Russian oligarchs just discovered what Putin tried to hide. And what happens next won't start in the streets. It'll start in the boardrooms. For years, the Kremlin told a story that almost everyone bought. Sanctions? Manageable. The economy? Adapted. The war? Necessary and sustainable. Russia was a fortress, built to outlast anything that the West could throw at it. And for a while, the numbers seemed to back that up. In 2023 and 2024, Russia posted GDP growth above 4%, fueled by a massive surge in military spending. Factories churned out tanks, shells, drones. Recruitment bonuses flooded cash into the hands of soldiers and their families. Unemployment hit historic lows. Consumer spending ticked up. The Kremlin's message was simple. The war is making us stronger. Western analysts were caught off guard. Headlines ran about Russia's resilient economy. Even the IMF seemed impressed. But here's what nobody is saying out loud. Wartime growth is not real growth. It's a treadmill. Activity will increase, factories are busy, unemployment is low, but the underlying civilian economy is being hollowed out. Investment in anything not connected to the war effort dries up. Productivity stalls. Inflation surges because money is chasing goods that can't easily be produced under sanctions. The state becomes the only customer that matters, and economic survival becomes inseparable from political loyalty. It's a sugar rush, and the crash is already here. The International Monetary Fund now projects Russia's GDP will grow just 0.8% in 2026, down from 4.3% just 2 years earlier. That's not a slowdown. That's the economy hitting a wall. And the engine behind that wall? Defense spending. Russia now dedicates roughly 40% of its entire federal budget to defense and security, an unprecedented level in modern Russian history. SIPRI estimated that Russia spent about $149 billion on its military in 2024 alone, a 38% increase from the year before. The International Institute for Strategic Studies puts the 2025 figure even higher, a record $186 billion. That's 7.3% of GDP being funneled into a war machine. And those are just the numbers that Moscow lets the world see. Around 84% of defense spending is classified. The real cost of this war is almost certainly higher than any official budget line reveals. For the first time under Putin's rule, pure military spending has surpassed social spending. Healthcare, education, social policy combined. That's not a budget. That's a bet. A bet that the war will justify the sacrifice before the economy buckles under the weight. So where is all this money coming from? Taxes are rising. The value-added tax just went up to 22% in January of 2026. Corporate profit taxes jumped from 20 to 25%. More small businesses are being dragged into the tax net, and the government is squeezing every ruble it can out of the population and private sector. And the National Wealth Fund, Russia's rainy day reserve, built painstakingly over decades of oil revenue, has been drained by 2/3 since 2022. Its liquid assets now sit at roughly $50 billion, down significantly since before the invasion. Some analysts estimate the Kremlin has enough liquid reserves to fund the budget until mid to late 2026 at current burn rates. And that is the optimistic scenario. After that, Moscow faces a choice that it hasn't confronted in Putin's entire tenure: borrow at crushing interest rates, print money and unleash inflation, or cut spending on the war. Meanwhile, January 2026 delivered a brutal reality check. The budget deficit in just 1 month nearly reached half the full-year target. Russia's economy isn't adapting to the war. It's being consumed by it. But economic strain alone doesn't end regimes. What ends regimes is when the men who profit most from the system begin to panic. And that's exactly what's happening. To understand why this moment is so dangerous for Putin, you have to understand the deal that he struck with Russia's oligarchs and why that deal is now falling apart. Russia didn't create the oligarch. They emerged from the chaos of the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed and enormous state assets were grabbed by whoever had the connections, the nerve, and the ruthlessness to take them. It was the Wild West. Fortunes were built overnight. Rules were written in pencil. What Putin did was rewrite those rules in stone. When he consolidated power, he sent a message that still echoes through every boardroom in Moscow. Wealth would be tolerated, even protected, as long as it stays out of politics. The lesson was delivered through Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, who dared to fund opposition parties and challenge the Kremlin's authority. His oil empire, Yukos, at the time the most valuable company in Russia, was dismantled piece by piece. He spent a decade in prison. Every oligarch in the country watched it happen and understood that this is what political independence costs. And for 20 years, that arrangement held. The oligarchs kept their fortunes, their yachts, their London mansions, their children in Swiss boarding schools. Putin kept control, a system of informal governance, networks of favor, access, and mutual dependency, evolved into something political scientists call patronal rule. Power flows through personal loyalty, not institutions. The greatest threat in the system, it's not public disagreement, it's elite defection. But the war changed the math. Western sanctions froze assets across Europe and the US. Super yachts were seized, properties locked, bank accounts shuttered. The global playgrounds that these men had spent decades building access to now suddenly were off limits. And domestically, things are getting worse. To fight inflation driven by runaway military spending, the central bank hiked interest rates to 21% in late 2024, a 2-decade high. Now, for ordinary Russians, that meant crushing borrowing costs. For oligarchs and major industrialists, it meant something even more alarming. Entire sectors of the civilian economy grinding to a halt. And they started saying so, publicly. Oleg Deripaska, aluminum magnate, one of Russia's most prominent billionaires, reportedly attacked the central bank's rate policy. Steel tycoon Alexei Mordashov warned that business development was being strangled. Sergei Chemezov, the head of Rostec, one of Russia's largest state defense conglomerates, and a man with deep personal ties to Putin, said Russia might have to halt arms exports just to survive the financial pressure. A think tank run by the brother of Russia's own defense minister called for rates to be cut by 5 percentage points to prevent the economy from sliding into stagflation, which is inflation without growth. Even the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, the most powerful business lobby in the country, proposed that the central bank should need government approval before setting monetary policy. In plain terms, the oligarchs were trying to strip the central bank of its independence. Think about what that means. In a system where public dissent gets you fined or jailed, Russia's wealthiest men are openly challenging one of the Kremlin's core economic institutions. They're not doing it because they've suddenly grown brave. They're doing it because they've seen the trajectory, and they don't think that the current path leads anywhere that they want to go. In any normal country, this would be just a policy debate. But in Russia, it's a power struggle disguised as economics. And then, something happened that isn't supposed to happen in a system like this. In December of 2025, a regional deputy in Samara stood up in the regional assembly, a body designed to perform loyalty, not challenge it, and called the war a failure. On the record, in a political setting built specifically to prevent moments like that. He was condemned by colleagues, referred to law enforcement. He was fined 30,000 rubles under the wartime censorship framework that Russia built in 2022. Laws that criminalize anything that discredits the armed forces or spreads false information about the military. Penalties range from heavy fines to years in prison. Since 2022, these laws have been used to crush anti-war expression at every level. Activists, journalists, ordinary citizens. The message was clear. Deviation from the official narrative would be treated as a criminal act. But here's what matters about the Samara episode. The state had to react. It couldn't ignore him, and the reaction confirmed something that the Kremlin would rather keep hidden. The words landed. When the system punishes an insider this publicly, it's admitting that the speech posed a threat. If it were meaningless, silence would have been enough. But this wasn't a protester on a street corner. This was an insider breaking the ritual of unity inside the machine itself. And he's not alone. Across Russia, the language of economic complaint is becoming a political signal. When businessmen attack interest rates, they're not talking about money. They're questioning competence. When regional officials start breaking the script, they're not just dissenting. They're calculating that staying silent might now be more dangerous than speaking up. In Russia, you don't criticize the system unless you think the system might already be weakening. If you're watching this unfold in real time, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because when elites turn on a system, it won't happen gradually. It'll happen all at once. And history shows exactly what comes next. Now here's where we need to pull back and look at the bigger pattern. Because what's happening in Russia right now isn't new. It's happened before, and it almost always ends the same way. Political scientists have a term for the group of supporters that every leader must keep satisfied to stay in power: the Selectorate. In democracies, that's a broad electorate. In authoritarian systems like Russia's, it's a much smaller coalition. Oligarchs, security chiefs, military leaders, regional governors, the people who actually keep the leader in power. The deal is simple. The leader distributes private benefits, access, contracts, protection, impunity, and in return, the coalition stays loyal. It can produce remarkable stability, even when the country as a whole is suffering, because the people who matter are being taken care of. But war and sanctions change that arithmetic. Resources shrink, costs rise. The leader has to extract more from the broader population just to keep the essential supporters fed. And at some point, even the supporters start feeling the squeeze. Sanctions on their assets, reputational damage, uncertainty about whether the leader can actually deliver a stable future. The Soviet Union offers the most powerful example. It didn't collapse because ordinary citizens took to the streets. It collapsed because key parts of the state and party apparatus lost confidence. The 1991 coup attempt, hardliners trying to preserve the old system, failed not because of popular resistance alone, but because too many insiders refused to support it. When the coercive apparatus hesitates, when elites won't act decisively for the leader, the whole illusion of inevitability can shatter in days. Russia today is not the Soviet Union of 1991. The mechanisms of control are different, but the structural lesson hasn't changed. Authoritarian durability isn't about public enthusiasm. It's about elite coordination. And when that coordination fractures, even slightly, the system becomes brittle. That's the pattern unfolding now in fragments. And Putin is caught in a trap that he can't escape. End the war, and he admits failure. The foundational myth of strength and competence, the very thing that kept the oligarchs loyal for 2 decades, collapses overnight. Every insider who staked their position on Putin's ability to deliver would suddenly be exposed, vulnerable, and unprotected. The question every oligarch would ask is not, what happens to Russia, but rather, what happens to me? Continue the war and the economic rot will deepen. Every month burns through more reserves, more credibility, more of the civilian economy's future. The demographic drain is accelerating. Hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, or fled the country since 2022. The labor market is stretched to breaking. Companies are desperate for workers, but the military keeps pulling men off factory floors and putting them into trenches. This isn't just a strategic dilemma, it's a legitimacy dilemma. And the evidence of that rot is now impossible to hide, even from the men that Putin most needs to keep in the dark. Russia's rail freight volumes dropped to a 16-year low in 2025. Declines hit 13 out of 15 cargo categories. Ferrous metals, the backbone of industrial production, collapsed by nearly 18%. Construction materials dropped over 10%. Grain shipments fell more than 12%. Steel production hit its lowest point in 7 years, with industry analysts calling it a full-blown crisis. Since the full-scale invasion began, cumulative rail freight has fallen more than 15%. Russian Railways, the country's largest employer and the artery that holds a nation spanning 11 time zones together, now carries a debt of nearly $512 billion. Its worst financial crisis in over a decade. The company has even floated selling its Moscow headquarters just to stay liquid. And here's what makes this so revealing. Rail freight isn't a glamorous indicator. Nobody makes viral videos about it. But historically, it's one of the most reliable barometers of an economy's real health. Because you can't fake physical goods moving across a country. When rail volume collapses, it means less is being produced, less is being built, less is being consumed, and the war economy is hollowing out the civilian economy from the inside. Fuel, the very symbol of Russian power, is under pressure as well. Ukrainian long-range strikes on refineries have disrupted production and distribution. Moscow has been forced to restrict fuel exports at times just to keep domestic markets stable. Oil and gas revenues in January of 26 came in 32% below target, and were only half the amount collected in January of 2025. Lower global prices, steeper discounts on Russian crude, a stronger ruble, and mounting pressure from Washington on India to reduce Russian oil purchases are all squeezing the revenue pipeline. And then there's the data that Russia doesn't want anyone to see. After the invasion, the Kremlin pulled detailed trade statistics from public view. The central bank stopped publishing customs data. Entire categories of economic reporting went dark. Independent researchers at institutions like Bruegel now rely on partner country custom records, importing countries' data, just to estimate what Russia is actually buying and selling. When a state starts hiding its own numbers from its own people, it's usually because those numbers tell a story that the leadership can't afford to let circulate. But concealment has a cost, and it's a cost that compounds over time. When businesses can't see reliable data, they can't invest rationally. When regional officials can't plan honestly, governance degrades quietly and steadily. When markets react to rumor instead of information, distortions multiply. And when elites suspect the truth is worse than whatever is being shown, trust erodes. Not in public, but in the private calculations that actually hold the system together. And that brings us to the most dangerous dynamic of all. Authoritarianism works when fear flows downward, from the leader, through the security apparatus, and into the population. Everyone knows the rules, everyone stays in line. The system looks unbreakable, but there's a tipping point that every authoritarian regime fears. The moment fear starts flowing upward. When insiders begin to suspect that the leader can't protect them, can't guarantee stability, can't deliver on the implicit promises that kept the coalition together, the entire calculation shifts. Loyalty stops being a conviction, and it becomes a transaction. And transactions can be renegotiated. Contingency planning replaces confidence. Money starts moving quietly, not out of Russia, which has become harder with sanctions and capital controls, but into hedged positions, diversified assets, structures that might survive a change in leadership. Families are positioned. Executives prepare exit strategies. Not openly, never openly, but in the private conversations that actually determine the future of authoritarian states. The tone has changed. Not because these people suddenly discovered democratic values, but because they've done the math, and the math no longer works in Putin's favor. The war was supposed to be a demonstration of strength, but instead, it's lasted longer than the Soviet Union's fight against Nazi Germany, a comparison with enormous emotional weight inside Russia. NATO didn't shrink, it grew. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. Sanctions didn't fade, they tightened. The economy didn't prove resilient, it proved dependent on a wartime treadmill that's now slowing down. Every signal, the Samara deputy, the oligarch revolts over interest rates, the collapsing rail freight, the draining reserves, the hidden budget numbers, they all point in the same direction. Not toward revolution, not toward street protests, towards something far more lethal to a system like Putin's: elite fragmentation. And here's what makes this different from every other Russia is falling apart prediction. This isn't coming from outside. It's not sanctions pressure or Western analysis or Ukrainian battlefield victories, though all of those do matter. This is coming from inside the system, from the very people who built it, sustained it, and profited from it for decades. The moment insiders stop believing that the leader can deliver a stable future, every actor starts calculating privately how to protect assets, how to protect families, how to protect positions, and how to survive what comes next. That process is already underway. We can't see all of it. By definition, it happens behind closed doors. But the signals that do break through are unmistakable. For 25 years, Putin controlled the narrative, the money, the fear. But something just fundamentally broke. And when the men who built their fortunes on stability begin preparing for instability, the end doesn't start in the streets. It starts in the boardrooms. So what do you think? Is Russia's ruling class already past the point of no return? Or does Putin still have enough leverage to hold the system together? Let us know in the comments, and if you're not subscribed to Fall of Nations, now's the time. Because what happens next in Russia could reshape global power for decades.